I did admire the ruthlessness of both the King and the Palace media operation, I have to say. The statement basically said, oh, the law must now take its course. I mean, the King might as well have said, lock him up, throw away the key, and I don't give a monkeys, to be perfectly honest.
You know, I think he's been cooked for a while. It's just the question of at what point does he leave the building?
I think you're right. I think a Green win is the most delicious and explosive because it will send shivers through the Labour Party, but it will also unnerve Reform and the people around Farage. Hello and welcome to Coffee House. I'm Tim Shipman, political editor of The Spectator, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Isabel Hardman, our assistant editor. Today we are going to be talking about Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, and her special educational needs reforms. We're going to be talking about the artist formerly known as Prince Andrew and his own special needs. And we're going to be talking about the Gorton and Denton by-election, which will overshadow everything by the end of this week. Today, Isabel, we have a big one, don't we? We have Bridget Phillipson, not the most beloved Secretary of State in the government, but she has her big plans for special educational needs and potential for a bit of controversy here. Talk us through what's going on.
Yeah, these are long-awaited reforms to the special educational needs and disabilities system in this country, which, as well as being unsustainable in terms of costs, I think this is a £4 billion overhaul. Certainly that's what the government's badging it as well as being very expensive. Parents find it unwieldy to navigate. They find it unpredictable. And it's one of those things that MPs have been raising consistently for, well over a decade now as a broken system. You know, it's a key constituent of their post bags. It's something they spend a lot of time discussing with individual constituents in their surgeries. And quite a few of them actually also have children themselves who have these EHCP certificates, education, health and care plans, for their own schooling. So it's something that MPs have a very strong view on, all of them. And it's something that the Treasury has a very strong view on as well. So the reforms that Bridget Phillipson has been setting out this morning, she's been giving a speech in the Midlands. It will change the levels of support available to school children in England. So there will be two levels. There will be targeted, which is for all pupils in mainstream schools, and specialist, which is for children with the most complex needs. And those are the children who will get these EHCPs in the future. They will only keep them until the next stage of their education. So when they move from primary to secondary to sixth form college and so on, they will be reassessed as they move. And that reassessment will begin in 2029. And there's also, alongside the assessment and the eligibility for the plans and the debate around what constitutes a special educational need and whether that definition is widening or whether we just have more children with higher needs, partly as a result of the pandemic. There's also this huge debate around transport costs for SEND school children, because I think the bill at the moment is around £3.4 billion, or sorry, that's what it's projected to reach by 2030. So that's just transporting.
I think it's about 2 billion now, isn't it? But they're predicting a big rise.
A five-fold increase to what local authorities were spending when it was first introduced in 2015. So again, that's something that councils have long been saying is unsustainable. And one of the reasons there is so much pressure around this, as well as I mentioned, the sort of individual constituency cases, is that it is a council issue. And as we know, many English councils are not just struggling financially, some of them are already, technically bankrupt. And the SEND bill is a major part of that.
Bluntly, the game here, Isabel, is that Bridget Phillipson's effectively limiting the number of families who can have this, but trying to provide more to those that have the most acute needs. And that's potential for sort of political problems there, I would think, and made perhaps worse by Labour's sort of VAT on private schools, because there's a lot of pupils who were in private education for special educational needs who are now having to move back into the state sector. Is that where the pressure from Labour backbenchers is going to fall, do you think?
So yes, your point about private schools is interesting, isn't it? Because that's quite ideologically awkward still for a lot of Labour MPs who just don't particularly want to confront that reality that parents are, not particularly well off parents, but parents are, as any of us do, just trying their best for their children and putting them into private provision. I think there's also the question which the Children's Commissioner, Dame Rachel de Souza, was raising this morning, which is, are any children currently on an EHCP going to lose it? And given the reassessment start in 2029, maybe not, but ministers have not committed to that. Bridget Phillipson has quite notably dodged that question. And it's often the sort of the critical mass of individual cases and the sense of people losing something they did have that will lead to a rebellion. And as you know better than anyone else, Tim, Labour backbenchers just don't trust the government to get this stuff right anymore. So it's not just that they don't trust the sort of, the detailed policy design, which I think MPs should always mistrust because it can inadvertently end up with a good reform being badly implemented. They don't really trust the overall principle either because they don't think that the government's head or heart is in the right place or that it will pursue reforms to the bitter end. So actually it's sort of, are these reforms or just sort of talking points that are going to be adapted? It's coming forward in a schools bill, so it's more than just a sort of discussion. But all the legislation we've covered over the past, year has changed dramatically on the floor of the Commons, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think they got a boost. I think Andy Burnham has backed these reforms on the basis that it doesn't take anything away from anyone. It will make it more difficult for some families to get it in future, but in theory, it doesn't take it away from anybody who's got it at the moment. But as you say, if we start getting cases where that isn't the case, then they could have a political problem. Mm-hmm. It seems like this cliff edge is potentially an area where backbenchers might try to tweak this thing. As you say, when you move from primary to secondary, this could be a big moment for a lot of families where they might potentially lose support that they've had or, find that they're entitled to less. I mean, that's inherent in what Phillipson's announcing. I mean, they seem to be aware of that in the DfE, but is that somewhere you detect that we might see a rebellion or potential problems on the floor of the House?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually, in terms of trying to change that entitlement and that reassessment. I think also just looking at, talking to teachers, particularly primary teachers I know in England, who feel as though the system has changed dramatically over the past few years, not on the basis of need, but on the basis of what little there is. So they will often say that, the one-to-one support that pupils that they had in their classes still need and used to have has disappeared. And the argument is often made that that's an old-fashioned model, whereas they very strongly believe that actually it's a cost issue and that the one-to-one support remains essential, but they just don't have it. And so they have much more chaotic classrooms as a result. So I think, as with the welfare reforms that collapsed last year, Labour MPs will be highly attuned to whether this is a cost-cutting exercise or a reform.
Yeah.
And Keir Starmer and colleagues have a tendency, as prime ministers often do, to think that their backbench colleagues aren't that bright. But I'd say you'd have to be quite daft to not know the difference between cuts and reform, generally.
I mean, Phillipson seems at least to be pitching it from her point of view as a reform, which is a mistake that Liz Kendall back at Welfare did not make. She didn't do that. And of course, it was immediately painted as we've got to save this money. And frankly, the Treasury made a Horlicks of that at the time. I mean, you say that the Treasury has strong views. They always have strong views about this sort of thing. I was interested at the start that you said they're pitching it as 4 billion, which is at least honest, because I've certainly heard people pitching it as a 7 billion reform, but at least half of that was announced in the budget last year. And, I guess the question that arises is, yes, there's some new money here, but is even the new money enough? Yeah. And are we still effectively creating a system based on the spending envelope rather than on what's actually required here.
Yeah, and again, I think we have, that we haven't talked about this yet, and we'll probably get onto it when we start talking about the by-election, but there's also the reform dynamic, and they have talked a fair bit about SEND, but sometimes from a slightly different perspective to Labour backbenchers, but let's not underestimate their ability to stir the pot on that as well.
Well, Labour still have some tricky times ahead, but perhaps not quite as tricky as going on over at the Palace at the moment, where we've seen yet another weekend of publicity about the artist formerly known as Prince Andrew. We've got constitutional issues rearing their head. We've got fresh claims in a piece I wrote on Friday that, what else was Prince Andrew passing on? I've picked up sort of concerns from people in the military sphere that, he had all these honorary titles, and quite a lot of the stuff he might have been doing as a trade envoy could or potentially have involved defence deals, and a lot of that stuff's pretty sensitive, and if he was blabbing all that to Epstein as well, that could be problematic. I'm sure the Spectator's lawyers would want me to mention at this point that Andrew denies any wrongdoing or any malfeasance, but all this is a bit of a mess, isn't it? And number 10, on the one hand, kind of look at this and think, well, thank God somebody else has got some problems as well as us. But it does present problems for Downing Street, doesn't it? That you've got, constitutional issues arising about the arrest of a member of the royal family. There's talk of, does the king have to testify? Will he have to give evidence to the police? There's even talk about, will things emerge that damage the reputation of the late Queen, who, as we all know, was pretty fond of Andrew and perhaps ignored warnings about some of the stuff that he was up to. So this is a bit of a double-edged sword for Downing Street, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I don't know what you think of how they've handled it thus far. I think that, the King's very quick statement after the arrest showed how ruthless the palace wants to be in terms of media management. And I don't know whether you agree with me, but I think to a certain extent it's almost easier for them than it is for Downing Street. And we haven't mentioned the other part of the dynamic here, which is obviously Lord Mandelson, well, ex-Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson as well. So I don't know.
The former Dark Lord, now the Dark Commoner.
The Dark Commoner, the Dark Peasant. I'd be interested in your thoughts more widely as well on how the Downing Street media operation is faring at the moment, given it is in is it fifth iteration?
I think we're now on to the fifth, yes.
Fifth, okay, yeah. But so I don't know what you think about where they are.
Well, I did admire the ruthlessness of both the King and the Palace media operation, I have to say. The statement basically said, the law must now take its course. I mean, the King might as well have said, lock him up, throw away the key, and I don't give a monkey's, to be perfectly honest. I mean, let's be honest, if this was the medieval era, Prince Andrew would have already been found floating in a river somewhere, or head deep in a bottle of, in a vat of something unpleasant. But that's not how we do things anymore. You can't even exile someone properly these days, Back before social media and, everybody with an iPhone, you could have packed him off abroad to some corner of the Commonwealth, and he could have lived a bucolic and quiet existence on a farm somewhere in, Kenya, as the late Queen would have said. But that's not viable anymore. So, they're stuck with him. Yeah, I was intrigued because I wrote on Friday that I quoted someone close to the palace saying, bluntly, we'd like him to go on trial and either be convicted and jailed or cleared, because at least that would draw a line under it one way or the other. I'll be honest, I expected a bit of pushback from the Palace on that. I'm not unknown to the Palace media operation because of some things I've written over the years. Not a dicky bird of criticism or complaint did I hear about that. And those that show a special interest in Prince Andrew's activities, I can't stop calling him that, unfortunately. It's just embedded in my head. But they are pretty ruthlessly distancing themselves and don't seem to mind what happens. Number 10, I mean, I wouldn't say the new comms operation particularly has a defined character yet, like some of them acquire. But you're right, I think, Mandelson is still an unexploded bomb in Whitehall. And, imagine working in the Cabinet Office right now, because you've got who are not only pouring through thousands of Peter Mandelson's messages to ministers, wondering which ones you can blank out because they're going to endanger Anglo-American relations or some kind of security issue, and which of them are just straightforward titillation and embarrassment that is going to explode in the government's face at some point. But elsewhere in the Cabinet Office, perhaps even the same people are currently probing what Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was up to. There we go, I've finally got it right. And, what an awkward job that is. Since the Cabinet Office is the bit that liaises with the private secretaries for the monarch and the other senior royals, and they're now having to, probe the King's brother. It's all, it's not necessarily a job that you would want right now.
No, not at all. And I suppose they've got the light relief later in the week of the by-election, so that'll keep Downing Street happily busy as well.
Yeah, no, and here we are speaking on Monday, and there's a lot of big stuff going on, but really the whole political week will be defined by the result of that by-election. The Greens are trying to make out that they're the challengers to reform and that Labour people should vote for them. Labour is trying to make out that they're the real challengers to reform and that Green voters should vote for them. And Reform is trying to work out which of them is actually behind and then big up that one as their rival so they can come through the middle. Everybody I speak to thinks this will be won on 32% of the vote max. But we're going to draw huge conclusions from the result, aren't we? I mean...
Oh, yes, we always do, don't we, about by-elections?
I mean, talk me through what you feel in your waters about this and what this would mean, if Labour were to win or the Greens were to win or Reform was to win, which is the most sort of seismic result, do you think?
Well, I think to a certain extent the most seismic result would be probably actually the Greens, because a Reform result is slightly more priced in. I don't know whether you agree with me on that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, because I think it would then also open up Labour's insecurity on its left flank and throw it into greater confusion over where it needs to be tacking, what it needs to be talking about. I think also the charisma of Zach Polanski as Green leader is threatening to Keir Starmer in a way that goes above the charisma of Nigel Farage, in the sense that it really does highlight the Prime Minister's lack of energy. And, I think it's probably fair to say that there's a sort of slightly... I'm going to get lots of bother online about this, but I don't really go on Twitter anymore, so it doesn't really matter. In fact, I still call it Twitter, which shows how little I go on it. There's a sort of Polanski fanboy movement out there, which I think some Labour MPs find quite difficult to deal with, and I think will become more of a feature if there was a Green result. But, I think that insecurity on the left of Labour about how they talk about immigration, about how they talk about the economy, would still be exacerbated in exactly the same way by a Reform win, because they will still be anxious that the party is tacking too far towards Reform and, to talking too much about immigration and so on at the expense of what those Labour MPs might see to be its core issues.
It does seem to me that this is going to dictate what next happens with the Labour Party. You've got a lot of those old Jeremy Corbyn cheerleaders, the Owen Joneses and Aaron Brastanis of this world, who seem deeply infatuated with Zach Polanski. They think he's a lot cooler than Keir Starmer, and they think he's more authentically left-wing than Keir Starmer. It's almost like Morgan McSweeney never existed. We're back to the kind of rows that were going on in the Labour Party between the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and the first sort of 3 or 4 months of Starmer getting in there and kind of purging all these people. We're now back to arguing about, just how left-wing the Labour Party should be. And even if Reform were to win, I don't think there'd be that many people in the Labour Party saying, this proves that McSweeney was right and we need to pivot towards them. So I think you're right. I think a Green win is the most delicious and explosive, because it will send shivers through the Labour Party, but it will also unnerve Reform and the people around Farage, who will start to cop it from the more radical parts of the online right that, are they blowing it? Are they, now being sort of frozen out by a sort of tactical vote on the left? Because that's with the second time, if it happens, that it's happened after the Caerphilly by-election, where Reform were pretty confident of winning. On the morning, Farage went up there expecting to be triumphant, and it didn't turn out that way. a lot of Labour votes pivoted towards Plaid Cymru at the last minute. And if they put the Greens over the top this time, I think there'll be some questions on the right as well. And you've already seen this splinter group. Rupert Lowe's sort of gang has created their new party, and there's certainly angst in Reform about leeching away a few percentage points, which could cost them big time in a national election. So we can't predict the result at this point, but I think we can predict that the fallout is potentially going to be pretty exciting. What if Labour hold on and win it, though? I mean, is Starmer then safe, do you think, or is it just everything deferred till May the 8th?
I mean, I don't think Starmer has been safe for a while. I don't think there's really a safe scenario anymore. In that, I suppose we've been talking about SEND reforms today, but really that we don't know whether the government's going to get those through. We don't really know if the government can get very much of its business through at all anymore. And as we've discussed previously on this podcast, that then raises the question of what's the point of Keir Starmer being in government, other than the things that make a prime minister in themselves feel important because they're still doing calls to, world leaders and so on, and they're still busy and they don't quite realise quite how futile they look from the outside. I think he's been cooked for a while. It's just the question of at what point does he leave the building, which I still can't believe I'm saying, actually. And I think whenever I do talk to Labour MPs, they can't quite believe they're saying it, but they are saying it, which is, oh, he's got to go. And I don't mean sort of troublemaker MPs who you could ring up and they'd, come on your radio programme and sort of mouth off about the government, a year ago. I mean, people who were really, really loyal to Starmer and who were really, really invested in a Labour victory and who were really grateful to Starmer for that Labour victory will now say quite openly, oh no, he's a goner. We've got to do something about this. So that whatever the result is on Thursday, everyone will have their own sort of theory about what it means. But I don't think it really actually changes the safety of the Prime Minister. I think that safety has gone.
Couldn't put it better myself, so I won't. Can't add to that, so I won't. So thank you very much to Isabel. Thank you to you for listening, and join us next time.